Okay, in this video, I'm going to tell you about the case of the disappearance of Paul Schroeder from the Sunset Point Christian Camp in 1972. This is a story that I first heard about when I was a kid, and I have just been fascinated by it ever since. So the camp is located just north of the town of Alberta Beach on the east side of Lac Ste, which is about 70 kilometers northwest of Edmonton. The camp was established in 1942, and it is owned and operated by a group of local churches. I attended one of these churches when I was a kid, and my grandparents and other family members have had various cabins in the camp over the years. My family and I would often visit my grandparents' cabin, and we would attend the annual summer family camp at the beginning of July. I even worked out at this camp cutting grass and cleaning bathrooms during my high school summers, and I've just spent a ton of time here over the years. And although I no longer attend the church or summer camp, I still spend a little bit of time at the cabin. I have early memories of my grandparents and older relatives telling me about the man that disappeared during one of the summer family camps. I was occasionally warned to be careful to not wander off too far from the camp, and this story would come up as a bit of a warning. The person who disappeared was Paul Schroeder. He was a hardworking and religiously oriented family man who had a cabin in the camp. He was born in 1900 and moved to Canada from Lubo, Poland in 1954 with his wife Aurelia and their children, and they settled in Edmonton, Alberta. Paul did not speak much English, but he was fluent in German, Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian. He lived with his family in the Strathcona neighborhood of Edmonton and attended the German Pentecostal Church on 99th Street. He worked for Western Arch Rib Structures in Edmonton until he retired in 1965, and that company is actually still around to this day. Paul Schroeder and his son Elf each had a family cabin at the Sunset Point Camp, which in 1972 was still called the German Pentecostal Camp. Paul's family described his time at the camp as being very special to him and his only real retreat from daily life. This is a quote from his son Elf in an Edmonton Journal article from July 13th of 1972. Quote, "He was a very religious man and liked to stay close to church activities. He never went on holidays at any time in his life. In his whole life, the cottage was the only relaxation he got." On July 6 of 1972, Paul Schroeder and his family had been enjoying the annual summer family camp for the week, and they were preparing to pack up and head back to Edmonton. I talked to Paul Schroeder's grandson, Dan, over the phone about this story. Dan was a boy at the time of his grandfather's disappearance, and he was with his family at the summer camp the day Paul went missing. Dan told me the basic story of what had happened immediately prior to his grandfather's disappearance. Paul wanted to gather up his family and travel back to Edmonton together as a unit. At about 5 p.m. that day, Paul visited his son Elf and Elf's family, including young Dan, at their cabin to discuss traveling back to Edmonton as a group. He then left his son Elf's cabin and walked over to his own cabin that he shared with his wife Aurelia. He discussed the travel plans with his wife, cut the grass in front of their cabin, and then went out to get some water to make coffee. He brought the water back to his wife so she could prepare some coffee, and that was the last time that she saw him. Paul's family started gathering to head back to Edmonton shortly before 6 p.m., and no one could find Paul anywhere. He was reportedly spotted by two other campers shortly after 6 p.m. walking on the east side of the camp, which is where his cabin was located, and pretty soon virtually the whole camp was looking for Paul. Local emergency services were quickly notified, and Alberta Beach Fire Chief Bill Nickel gathered up the volunteer firemen to help with the search. After a few hours of searching the camp and surrounding areas and not finding any sign of Paul, the disappearance was reported to the Stony Plain RCMP at 9 p.m. that evening. And over the next few days, the search expanded and intensified. The RCMP brought in airplanes and helicopters as well as canine trackers. Multiple boats searched and dragged the lake, and the local Sturgeon River was also searched extensively. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder throughout the entire area. My own grandpa has talked many times about personally searching for Paul in the surrounding forests and fields around the camp. The RCMP distributed a bulletin to all police units in Alberta as well as RCMP divisions throughout Western Canada, advising them to be on the lookout for Mr. Schroeder. RCMP and municipal police services searched buses, trains, and airports throughout the province of Alberta. 2 bus loads of troops were brought in from the Edmonton military barracks to help out with the search, and multiple newspaper articles from across the province highlighted this case in the months after his disappearance. Family and friends would continue to search for clues of Paul's whereabouts throughout the summer, and in the fall, when the trees had lost their leaves, the RCMP conducted conducted another series of air searches of the area due to the increased ground visibility. And there was also another large ground search done at this time as well. Paul was never found, and no one has ever come across any items of his clothing or any clues to his whereabouts. So Paul Schroeder was said to have had mobility issues. He walked in a stooped, shuffling manner and moved really slowly. This is another quote by his son Elf during the search. Quote, "Because of the way he walks, he has a tendency to fall over small obstacles, and when he's down, he can't get himself up." End quote. He was also almost blind in his left eye, and he had trouble hearing, and he was said to have had minor signs of dementia, such as forgetting names of family members occasionally and getting confused regarding directions. It seems unlikely that he would have made it very far wandering away on foot, and the search of the surrounding area was extensive. There is a quote in an Edmonton Journal article from August 8th of that year that says, quote, "The 72-year-old man is thought to have blundered into the bush surrounding the cottage," end quote. This just seems highly unlikely. Paul Schroeder had serious mobility issues and would not have made it far in the woods. He had also just made plans with his family to leave the camp, and he had never wandered off into the woods before. Also, the camp is not deep in the Alberta wilderness. The camp itself is bordered by forest on the south and east sides, and the area between the camp and the town of Gunn to the north in particular is very heavily wooded, even to this day. But there are many residents and farmers in the surrounding area as well. The area has long been populated with permanent residents. The greater region around the lake is actually mainly farmland, and the camp area is located between two well-traveled highways, and the whole region around the lake would have been experiencing its busiest time of the year. This is a rural area, but it's not remote, and there were a lot of people in the surrounding region at the time Paul went missing. I briefly talked to Bill Nickel on the phone a couple years ago. He was the fire chief in Alberta Beach at the time of Paul Schroeder's disappearance, and he was the first emergency services responder to assist in the search. He told me over the phone that multiple police canines tracked Paul's scent trail to the main gates of the camp, where the scent trail ended. This would obviously suggest that Paul may have been picked up by a vehicle somehow and taken away, and that is certainly what Mr. Nickel believes. This detail about the dogs tracking Paul's scent to the gates of the camp was never mentioned in any of the newspaper articles. The only specific mention of canine trackers in the articles referenced them being deployed along the Sturgeon River. Further adding to the idea that Paul Schroeder was picked up by a vehicle is that he had been known to hitchhike and catch rides occasionally in the past. Although Paul had never just randomly gone off and hitchhiked out of the blue. He had hitchhiked to travel to where he had planned on going. As I heard this story from different people growing up, most of them seemed to think it had something to do with hitchhiking or getting picked up as well. But Paul did not have a history of wandering off and getting lost. He hitchhiked deliberately and not randomly. I also find it unlikely that if Paul Schroeder had had a mental episode where he walked to the main road and tried to hitchhike, would anyone have really picked up a confused elderly man who doesn't speak English very well? And if it's true that Paul's scent was tracked to the main gates, I mean, I guess it's possible too that maybe a car hit Paul as he was near the main gates and then took his body in an attempt to cover up this event. But I personally find these scenarios unlikely. The camp was full of people at the time. It was the annual family camp, and the main gates area is where people crossed from the west side to the east side of the camp. People walk by this area a lot, and both sides of the camp are used equally, and the main gates just see a lot of foot traffic as well as car traffic. There is no evidence that Paul was hit or abducted by a vehicle, and elderly men are very infrequent abduction victims. People who are kidnapped or taken against their will tend to be younger and female. It also seems like if someone was wanting to abduct anyone from the camp, they would hide out in the trees surrounding the perimeter of the camp instead of grabbing someone from the front gates where they would be more likely to be seen. And of course, drowning was considered as a possibility, but if he did happen to end up in the water, it is very likely, although not completely certain, that his body would have eventually washed up on shore. It's typically in the colder months when a drowned body may stay submerged at the bottom of a body of water, but most bodies that end up dead in a lake tend to float to the surface and eventually wash up on shore, especially in the warm summer months. During the search for Paul, the lake was dragged and searched extensively by multiple police and civilian boats, and no trace of Paul was found on, in, or near the water. There's a researcher named David Politis who runs the Can-Am Missing Project, which is an organization that researches and presents unusual missing persons cases. I followed his work for years, and I'm going to discuss the Can-Am Missing Project at length in another video down the road, and you can find him on YouTube under Can-Am Missing Project if you're not aware of them. recommend if you're interested. David Paulides included the case of Paul Schroeder in his book Missing 411 Canada because it has a few of the profile points that he noticed when compiling his cases. His research mostly looks at more rural cases with no clear evidence of human or animal predation and tries to omit cases where a person was suicidal or expressed an interest to run away. In the cases compiled by the Can-Am Missing Project, certain profile points of the disappearances come up more often than you might expect by chance. Interestingly, people of German heritage and German speakers go missing at a rate noticeably higher than their proportional representation in the population at large. Mr. Schroeder was of German heritage and spoke German as his primary language. Another profile point highlighted by Dave Paulides and his team is that a lot of the cases they looked at occurred very close to water. People disappearing very near to a large body of water and then disappearing entirely or being found in the water under very strange circumstances. And yes, it is true that most human settlement and activity is located close to major water bodies such as oceans, rivers, and lakes, but a lot of the strange cases outlined in the Can-Am Missing Project occur very close to the water and involve water pretty heavily, and Paul Schroeder did go missing close to a large body of water. Another interesting profile point Dave Paulides noticed is that people go missing at a disproportionate rate at places with the word devil in the name. For example, Devil's Canyon, Devil's Gulch, Devil's Nest, etc. He presents a lot of these cases in his Missing 411 book, Devils in the Details. Interestingly, Lac Ste has gone through a few different names. Before it was renamed Lac Ste Anne, it was referred to as Devil's Lake by the early European explorers and settlers, and before that it was called Spirit Lake or God's Lake by the local indigenous groups. And these are just some profile points about this case that have parallels to a whole bunch of other similar cases that have occurred throughout North America over the years, and it was just interesting to me that the Can-Am Missing Project looked into this case as well. And so it's been just over 51 years since Paul Schroeder disappeared from the camp, and no trace of him has ever been found. I really feel for his family who lost their grandfather, husband, and father that day to an event that ended with just a frustrating and confusing lack of closure. And obviously, as someone who's not related to Paul and who wasn't even alive when he disappeared, I'm able to sort of look at this story in a more detached way, and it's just really fascinated me, and it has really made this camp seem mysterious. And honestly, I don't really have a personal opinion on what I think happened to Paul. I think it's unlikely that he was abducted or hit by a car and picked up, just because so many people were around, and it just seems like someone like him would not have been abducted. Of course, anything is possible, and who knows. I think it's unlikely he ended up in the water just because no one saw him near the water, and his body never surfaced or washed up and has never been found to this day. And so this case remains unresolved. No further clues as to what happened to Paul have ever been found, and I hope that Paul's family was eventually able to heal and mostly move on from this very strange event. And so that's the story of the disappearance of Paul Schroeder. The county of Lac Ste Anne has a bunch of other really interesting stories, and down the road I plan on doing more videos from this area. I hope you found that interesting and informative, and if you'd like to watch more of my videos in general, please subscribe to my channel. I upload at least one new video per week, but really it's about one video per week. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.